Frankenstein is an American sci-fi horror short film written and directed by Searle Dawley, with cinematography by James H. White. Released in 1910, it's based off of the 1818 novel Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, and it stars Augustus Phillips as Dr. Frankenstein, Charles Ogle as the monster, Mary Fuller as Frankenstein's fiancée, and Brooke Maddox as Henry. At almost 13 minutes, it's silent, and I would classify it as appropriate for ages 7 and up due to some mildly frightening imagery. Most people familiar with the Western literary canon are well aware of Frankenstein by the English author and creator of science fiction, Mary Shelley. The novel is justifiably regarded as a classic, and has been lauded for centuries for its inventive plot, iconic characters, and complex themes. It's really no surprise then that someone would attempt an adaptation so early in film history. What is a surprise, though, is how they went about doing it. Searle Dawley was an American film director, screenwriter, playwright, and actor who got his start in theater before transitioning to film work in 1907. He was hired by Edison Studios and in 1910 opted to write what he called a scenario for Frankenstein, something similar to a script summary. At this point in his career, Dawley had made a bit of a name for himself within the studio system, not due to his creative or technical prowess, but because of the breakneck speed at which he could produce films. At some points, he was churning out as many as 3 films per week. For him, it seems that making films was more about speed over quality, at least in the beginning of his career. This adaptation of Frankenstein was not excluded from his commitment to rapid production. It was filmed over the course of a mere 3 days in January of 1910 at the company's Bronx location. We actually still have the scenario that Dawley wrote for the film, and it's a fascinating read. It makes it very evident that he wanted to capture the drama of Frankenstein and tackle some of its themes, but strangely intended to do so without making it disturbing or depressing. It feels as though Dawley was both trying to cater to an easily shocked general public and also failed to grasp the main conceits of the novel, which are inherently disturbing. Further assisting in the neutering, for lack of a better term, of the subject matter of Shelley's work was the fact that Edison Studios was very concerned with not violating conservative social norms. The studio's staff writers were adamant in assuring audiences that the film would not focus on the horror or grotesquerie of its source material. Gone would be the implied mutilation of corpses to create the monster. Gone would be Frankenstein's overt flaws and the monster's complexity. And gone would be the subjects of child murder, suicide, and the nature of God and creation. In fact, allow me to quote the brief that the staff writers released. In making the film, the Edison Company has carefully tried to eliminate all actual repulsive situations and to concentrate its endeavors upon the mystic and psychological problems that are to be found in this weird tale. Whenever, therefore, the film differs from the original story, it is purely with the idea of elimination of what would be repulsive to a moving picture audience. So, the ensuing filming was more focused on spectacle than capturing the essence of the novel. It was decided that the centerpiece of the film would be the creation of the monster, something that is never even shown on the page. In this iteration, the creation would involve a chemical reaction. This feat was achieved by lighting a dummy on fire and playing the footage of it melting backwards to create the illusion of a figure rising from the flames and fumes. It is arguably the most impressive aspect of this film, displaying the kind of inventiveness and creative grit that to this day make up the heart and soul of the practical effects world. The film was released in March of 1910, and while we don't know how audiences received it, we do know the feedback of 2 critical entities. The Film Index, a New York magazine, was extremely complimentary towards the film's creature creation sequence. Conversely, the critic W. Stephen Bush, engaging in some good old-fashioned moral panic, wrote this of the film: "I have the sincerest admiration for the Edison and Vitagraph studios, but it must be said, with all due deference to these distinguished producers, that such films as Frankenstein and Mystery of Temple Court, while delightful literature to coroners, undertakers, gravediggers, and moorkeepers, fail to please the general public. Fail to please is putting it mildly. Death scenes and executions are interesting historical reading when well described, but a portrayal of these things on a living screen may well be dispensed with." Yeah, so in the end, despite all of their efforts to sand Frankenstein down into something inoffensive and digestible, Edison Studios failed. They didn't understand that even the core concept of the story they wanted to adapt was, in itself, too subversive to please conservative viewers. Its critical reception aside, this film faced the same threat as many, many early motion pictures: improper storage. As a result, for decades, it was believed lost, with the only remaining proof of its existence being discovered in 1963 in the form of a summary and handful of stills from a 1910 issue of the Edison Kinetogram. It was not until the 1970s that the existence of a print of the film was made public, after a film collector realized the rarity of a seemingly innocuous print he'd purchased decades prior. Between the years of 2010 and 2018, several different film organizations undertook restorations of the print, including the Library of Congress, which released theirs in 2018. As I've stated, this is a simplified rendition of Shelley's classic tale. In it, a young man travels to college where, after 2 years, he decides to unnaturally create life, using nothing but a chemical reaction. Immediately horrified by the reality of the creation he spawned, he flees, ultimately returning home and attempting to reclaim normalcy by marrying his fiancée. Unfortunately for him, his creation has followed him. Even though I'm a writer myself, I actually don't hold to the belief that source material is sacred. I don't think that a film adaptation has to be identical or even close to its source to be good. What matters, in my opinion, is if a film does justice to the core conceit of the work it's adapting. I'm perfectly fine with movie adaptations that add or remove scenes, alter characters, or even diverge from the original plot, because I know that sometimes changes must be made to effectively transition a story from one medium to the next. The truth is, aspects of literature just don't always work on screen. It's why I believe the entirety of House of Leaves is basically unadaptable, and why the unknowability of cosmic horror is often so hard to get right in any visual medium. Anyways, I'm saying this because I want it to be clear that I don't dislike a film just because it differs from its source material. I'm very flexible. In fact, in 2025, Guillermo del Toro released his adaptation of Frankenstein, and I thought it was fantastic, despite deviating quite a bit from the novel at many points. Del Toro still understood and loved the novel, and this led to the heart of the story translating almost perfectly, and any changes that were made feeling pretty at home within it. But back to 1910's Frankenstein. There is no softening this. I borderline hate this film. I think it fails in almost every way. Its greatest weakness is what perhaps matters most for a gothic science fiction horror film: its writing. The characters are without any depth, and while you could argue that this is to be expected for an early silent film, I have to push back with, then why even try to adapt a story that relies upon the complexity of its characters? Frankenstein is the flaws and desires and downfalls of both Victor and the creature. It is Victor's obsession and hubris, his abandonment of the very life he sought so hard to create, and the creature's resulting isolation and rage. Without the character's inner worlds, there's no plot. You can't tell a story ripe with parental abandonment or scientific folly if you don't have the time or resources needed to convey them. But you might be asking, well, hold on, what if you step back and view it not as an adaptation, but as its own independent work? Is it good then? To which I say, no, I think it might be worse. Because without the basic knowledge of Frankenstein's story, the plot is kind of unintelligible. It is terribly paced. We are presented with short scenes often spaced with huge time jumps and minimal details about what occurs during said time jumps. For example, we see Victor leave for college, then it just jumps ahead to 2 years later when he's making the monster. We're not told anything about what happened between those points. We don't learn about his personality or his motivations or how he figured out how to make a guy. He just does it, and then he gets upset. It literally says 2 years later, Frankenstein has discovered the mystery of life. I will say the actors do what they can with the material they're given. They just don't have a lot to work with. Phillips gives it his all as Frankenstein. You can really see at points that he's trying to show the character's hubris and inner conflict, despite the script's limitations. And Ogo is okay as a skulking monster, he's just really limited. The script does not have the pacing or the depth needed to allow for the humanized performances we've come to expect with the creature, like those done by Boris Karloff or Jacob Elordi. So the story and characters aren't good, but what about the technical aspects of this film? Well, that's a mixed bag. Most elements are serviceable. The sets aren't super realistic, but there's quite a few different ones, and they're well dressed. They have an appropriate amount of furniture and decorations. The costumes are also fine, barring the monsters, which is nonsense. This is mirrored by the makeup, which is normal for the rest of the cast, and abysmal for the monster. I hate how he looks. It again makes no sense and is not interesting or really comprehensible. His wig and face paint, I'm not sure what they're trying to communicate. Is he meant to look corpse-like or artificial? It's just maybe the worst visual portrayal of the monster I've seen. Maybe. Honestly, the only above average technical feature here are the special effects, especially during the creature's creation. The idea of burning and melting a doll and playing that backwards was very clever, and it looks pretty cool, honestly. I really enjoyed that sequence, and the fact they even puppeted the limbs around to add life to it. There's also a much subtler effect used at the end involving a substitution splice that works pretty nicely. If this had just been a quick trick film a la Georges Méliès, existing solely as a special effects showcase, I think it would have been a lot better. Instead, it's a high concept executed with low effort. Nowhere is this most embodied than in the ending of the film, which, without spoilers, I will say is barely comprehensible if you don't read the scenario, and pretty stupid if you do, honestly. I am going to give Frankenstein a 1 out of 5. I'd really only recommend it to hardcore fans of film history, sci-fi, Frankenstein, or early special effects, who are willing to engage with it on a strictly technical level. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be very appreciated. You can find my other reviews on this channel, starting all the way back with my review of the first horror film ever made in 1896. You can also follow me on Blue Sky, Letterboxd, and Instagram at Under the Fleapit. If you like what I do and want to support the channel, my Ko-fi donation page and Patreon will both be linked in the description of this video. Until next time, this has been Under the Fleapit. Stay spooky!